Hi Ali, and welcome to your first ArchDaily interview. Can you please start by introducing yourself?
Well, my name is Ali Karimi, the co-founder of a practice called Civil Architecture. Along with Hamid Bukhamseen, we founded Civil Architecture as a practice interested in buildings and books about them. Being that we are based in the Gulf region, we're very much interested in thinking about architecture as a process that begins with storytelling and research, building a body of knowledge about the region, and then translating that into design proposals and exhibitions. Over the past 7 years, we've worked at a variety of scales, from the scale of a design for a building to the scale of a publication, which was a t-shirt for a temporary installation in Muharraq. And it's through these projects that we aim to produce a civil discourse, really asking what it means to be producing architecture in an uncivil time in one of the world's most energy-intensive and exhaustive parts of the world.
Ali, what does it mean to produce architecture in an uncivil time?
We're based in the Gulf region. The Arabian Peninsula is one of the leading exporters of fossil fuels and leading users of fossil fuels as well. And so we're very much implicated not only in the fuel economy and thus the energy economy of the world, but we're also very much implicated in the future vision and the visions of architecture as they play out in Dubai, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain and Kuwait, and then are exported to the rest of the world. And so very much as a practice based in the region, we were interested in exploring what it means to produce architecture in a way that runs counter to these narratives. So looking and trying to find sources of stories and ways of thinking about the architecture and the urbanism of the region outside purely the narrative of the oil economy. And so to produce that kind of architecture means producing a context through practice. This means doing research projects, finding ways of understanding the places we're in, and thus composing a kind of totalizing vision of our context as a way of producing and generating architectural work, but maybe more importantly, to provide us with the ability to evaluate the work we produce. And so it's really thinking about practice as context and the possibility of using practice to build your own context to site projects, but then also to evaluate the projects that surround you.
You run a multidisciplinary firm. How do you approach each new architectural venture, building, book, installation?
We tend to work through thematics. So over the past 7 years, the themes develop, one linking into the other, but they begin with a question. Predominantly, those questions are about finding ways of articulating the scale of the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. So for example, beginning with the Kuwait Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, the question was, how do we understand the city-states and the countries that we inhabit, not through, let's say, national narratives, but very much through ecological and spatial narratives. So I was interested in understanding the Gulf, not through the narratives of the cities and the states that embody it, but perhaps just through the littoral aspect, the relationship of people to the sea. And so it began, for example, with this thematic of exploring the region through the lens of water, which then led to a research project about fish traps and water channels, which then led to an investigation of farming. So it's very much a process of respatializing and recontextualizing the Arabian Peninsula through research works. Now, how that ties to design work is each of the projects explores this thematic of whether it's seasonality or water, relationship to resources, and they begin to provide us with case studies, contextual precedents, and narratives that we find might have been lost in the years where the focus has been on promoting new cities or the tabula rasa or the oil extractive context. And so these narratives not only help us understand the place where we're sited, but help us pull through and then produce new design work that relates to that context.
So civil architecture was part of the first Doha Design Biennial. Can you tell us more about your intervention, house between the Jujube Tree and the palm tree?
Yeah, the house, which was also a majlis, so a gathering room, was initially done as an extension to a existing home, a 1950s home in a compound in Bahrain. And so it began as an extension, which was just an office space / majlis, so a gathering room where the owner of the house could see guests, and then over time became a very small house in the garden. We were interested in showing it for the Doha Design Biennial in the form of a one-to-one model. Given that the house was actually a kind of an 8x8 space, we were able to replicate the roof of the house and the rooms under it and some furniture in its totality in Design Doha. The reason why we thought it was important to show it is ultimately the house was a response to some of the program, but more importantly, it was the response to the relationship to the garden. So it was about what it means to position a house between two trees, which was initially not part of the brief, but it was where the client saw the house being positioned. When we spoke to him, he said, I really see it between this tree and this tree. And somehow, sometimes when you give a working title to a project, a house between the palm tree and the Jujube Tree, just as a way of initiating the project, the title becomes, and the project takes on a life of its own. And so we thought it was important for Doha to show what it means to have a form that responds to these two trees as a way of articulating and understanding seasonality, the maintenance of the two trees, and the sort of the life of a house and a garden would embody.
You have previously collaborated with Studio Libani, ArchDaily New Practices in 2020, on a landscape and installation project, Minor Paradises, in Amman, Jordan, during Amman Design Week in 2019. Can you tell us more about that project?
Yeah. It was a great collaboration with a landscape studio, and initially when we began the conversation, we said, you know what, it would be amazing to pitch an installation for Amman Design Week that taps into the landscape of Jordan in general. I mean, it's just largely kind of like a crystalline configuration. The geology of the place being that it's since Roman times and before was one of the main sources of the kind of extraction and exportation of stone, and where stone would be dressed for thousands of years. So we were interested in doing a landscape intervention as a proposal, which talked about Amman, but talked about the idealization of certain ways of seeing landscape. And so in a conversation with Studio Libani, we said, okay, what's a way we can pitch to do a public space that allows us to have conversations about geology, topography, and material use? And initially we had pitched it as models for Amman Design Week, but we found a way of requesting materiality from local contractors. So we said, you know what, we can actually do a public plaza or landscape by borrowing sand, aggregate, stone from contractors and then returning it once the week was over. And so we worked on producing a landscape proposal, which was a set of different kinds of sand, different kinds of stone, a kind of landscape of mounds and selected greenery, and to have that be the public plaza for Amman Design Week over the course of the week. And it was an inhabitable public space. All the materials returned to the contractors after the duration of the event, and even the benches, which were done in plywood, were then donated to local schools and public parks. And so the idea was very much this inhabitable landscape, but I think the nexus of the idea was there was no budget to do a public space, but by finding a way of understanding what's available and what could be easily and cheaply sourced in Amman, the proposal was a way of thinking about landscapes, but it was also a way of thinking about the short-term durations of installations and how you can work around it to do something much larger and much more spatial and also social.
Now let's talk more about your built and unbuilt works. What projects stand out from the rest in your portfolio, in your opinion?
I think different projects do different things, and different projects touch on different aspects of the thematics we're interested in exploring. I think probably if someone was approaching it from the perspective of just narratives about ecology or landscape, then our design for a public park in Riyadh, to me, stands out. The proposal for Abu Makhroob, which is a combination of a productive landscape for a public park. So a public park which consists of planting what's typically planted in farms around Saudi Arabia. So palm trees, alfalfa, onions, and different kind of fruits and fruiting trees, as well as vegetables. I would say maybe from a non-design perspective, some of the research work, publications like Foreign Architecture Domestic Policy, which was looking at 5,000 gas stations that Kuwait has owned and built around Europe, to me is an interesting kind of political and architectural venture. It's a narrative that sums up the last 50 years of Kuwaiti intervention as a kind of exportation of both oil and Kuwaiti foreign policy, soft power, abroad. To me, that's a way of thinking about architecture as a unit of kind of political capital that's been placed outside. And talks about how we think about the limits of a country spatially, not only as a kind of colonial-decolonial relationship, but the kind of the overlap of public interest, private interest, and architecture's role as an embassy abroad. I think those two, for me, kind of cover different aspects of the practice, both as design and also as a way of thinking about what spatiality even means in today's architectural setting.
And what is one of your most provocative works so far?
I'd say it was one of the early works, which was the Kuwait Pavilion. The Kuwait Pavilion was pitched as the national representation of Kuwait. However, it was very much interested in changing the narrative of the Gulf. So thinking about the Gulf and the countries that inhabit it and share it through its islands. So there's 300 islands that are in the Gulf that are shared between or contested between Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Oman. And rather than looking at them as points of contestation, almost things that exist in the water and so we think and forget about them, or as private developments. I'm thinking of like the Nakhil, so the Palm Island in Dubai, or various developments in Bahrain and Kuwait and so on. We pitched it as a shared pavilion, so a pavilion which looked at histories of the islands in the Gulf as the beginning point. So shared narratives between the different Gulf states, as well as Iran, and then inviting proposals for what to do with these islands, many of them still contested to this very day, by architects based in Oman, the UAE, the US, Iran. Initially, we were told, look, you can't do a pavilion which engages these different countries, that engages with this politics. But then the narrative, particularly from the side of the Kuwait National Council for Culture, Arts and Letters, was if it doesn't occur in the space of architecture and doesn't occur in the space of culture as a way of rethinking these zones, as a way of rethinking these political narratives, then who can have these conversations? And somehow the book managed, the book and the publication, and the pavilion managed to happen. And it managed to bring these different voices and these different contributors that I think otherwise would not have met in the space of a Gulf Pavilion.
Finally, Ali, how would you perceive the future of architecture, especially in the Middle East?
It's a great question. And I would say maybe for us, it's a rebuttal initially of the question of the future. I think so much of the promotion of the future in the Gulf and the promotion of the narrative of the future has kind of come at the expense of, well, one, talking about the past, but also talking about this kind of long present. There's been the promotion of commercial developments, neoliberal policies, the exportation of oil, all working within an idea of the future. But for us, we're very much interested in operating in and working within this kind of extended present. So a lot of the thematics we're interested in exploring, a lot of the ways we look at architecture are about improving the current moment, thinking about how do we live, what does it mean to inhabit a house over the course of the year, what does it mean to inhabit a landscape over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 years. And for us, this way of thinking about the practice and thinking about the future allows us to deal with issues that are on the ground, but ultimately moves us away from this idea of unattainable futures or unsustainable futures, and really thinks about what values we hold dear in the present and how can we work through issues that are ongoing in this present moment. And for us, it really deals with bridging between what exists, what has existed, and what could exist, but not putting it at such a time scale that everything which is at stake in the moment is kind of forgotten in the hopes for a kind of rosier or more optimistic architectural future. And one which is not in service in actually kind of making things sustainable, actually. We want to think of it in a different way.
Would you like to add anything else?
I think what's most exciting for me, and this is maybe not so much about the future, but it's about the present. I think what's exciting is we're seeing practices that are beginning to emerge after maybe 60, 70 years of architectural production in the Gulf that's primarily been centered around negating the tabula rasa, or centered around promoting these cities as places for the stockpiling or shifting of global capital. And these practices are producing research, they're producing bodies of work that look for other ways of producing architecture, look for other ways of being rooted, and for other ways of thinking about the time and architecture's relationship to time. I think those spatial narratives and those architectural narratives are germane to this part of the world, but I think they connect to other practices in South America, Europe, US, Africa, and Asia. And for me, it's interesting seeing this dialogue emerge. I think it's not about the future, but it's about ways of thinking about the present and making architecture separate from these kind of global narratives. And to me, that's exciting.
Thank you.
Cool.